afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. I am pretty excited about this, except for the fact that I don't know how to advance the slides. There we go. So, why crayfish? This kind of should lead us into why I'm here talking about these things. Most of you know that Lake Michigan has seen drastic changes over the past decades, from one that was much more productive than it is now to what we have now, where chlorophyll is super low through much of the year. Key native species are really either very rare, localized, or nearly gone, or in some cases even gone. I never thought we'd get to this place with Diperia, but sure enough, we are. Given the declines in chlorophyll, primary production, we happen to have seen some declines in preyfish as well. And the preyfish biomass estimates are well below the FCO for what that's worth, and these decreases in preyfish that we've seen have led to changes in stocking. Preyfish are important economically and ecologically. They provide food for stocked salmonines, and people like to catch those salmonines. So the fewer preyfish we have available for those fish, the less opportunity there will be to catch big fish, right? So they're also important to the food web, though. They can play a major role as a conduit for energy between lower trophic levels and higher trophic levels. And in fact, there are many cases, examples of this group of organisms completely structuring zooplankton communities, and that leading to stable or unstable shifts in food webs. What I'm going to talk about today, our survey methodology will be described very briefly. I'm going to talk about temporal and spatial patterns in species that are common to the survey, species that are only caught in the acoustic survey or only observed in the acoustic survey, and I'll present a time series for the benthic fish from the bottom trawl survey. Try to make a little bit of survey comparison, which we try to do every year, and then present what I think are our conclusions based on the latest data. The two surveys are actually quite different in many respects. They have day-night differences. The bottom trawl survey happens during the day. The acoustic survey happens at night. The area or distance sampled by these two surveys is quite different, or the volume sampled, if you want to call it that. They are different in the part of the water column that they sampled. The bottom trawl survey really only samples the bottom 1.5 or so meters, while the acoustic survey samples probably 3 to 4 meters below the surface all the way down to, we'll say, a 0.5 meter or a meter above bottom. The bottom depth range that these surveys sample has become more similar than in the past, with increased effort from the bottom trawl survey at deeper depths. So there is a fair bit of overlap there. There are numerous species that these surveys have in common in terms of how they assess them, alewife, smelt, and bloater particularly. And there are also species that seem to be unique to these surveys. So that's, in my mind, why these surveys are complementary and really serve to provide a decent picture of what's going on. So now I'll talk about temporal and spatial patterns with species that are common to the surveys. I'm going to start with young of year alewife. We have a number of graphs like this that are going to be difficult to see apparently because I picked a bad color, but there will be one line for the bottom trawl survey, it'll be black, and another line for the acoustic survey that will be blue. You can see this fairly large difference between the bottom trawl survey and the acoustic survey for this particular organism, H0 alewife, in terms of the density estimate. We do have one point in time where it was they were pretty consistent, but we, I think, considered that to be fairly unusual. You can look at this and see that there are a couple of pretty strong year classes in 2005, 2010, and also some peaks in 2012 and 2016. They're not as big as these, but they're still relatively large compared to some of the other years. Ultimately, I would argue that the density of young of year fish from the acoustic survey this year is probably about average. The next organism is yearling and older alewife. These are fish that these surveys have at times sampled quite differently, and there's been a divergence of these surveys in the past few years. As a rule, the acoustic survey has been higher. We can see both surveys show there's an increase in biomass density in 2018. That increase in biomass density for the acoustic survey is quite a bit larger. We can also see in the bottom troll survey, which right now what I'm presenting is our only measure for the, I'll call it the old days when things were much more productive. You can see that the alewife assessment with the bottom troll shows that alewife declined way before we had any mussels in the lake. And even here, things were nowhere near what they had been in the past. And then you had this period where we introduced mussels to the lake and things have just started going down again. Recently, I zoomed in on this, you can really start to see that things have been fairly different for a number of years in these two surveys. And in particular, this emphasizes the difference here. One of the things that's important to note about that particular point for the bottom troll survey data, in spite of the fact that we can argue, yes, it's an increase, we can look at their distribution and see what kind of an impact that distribution has. This is a plot showing the age composition of alewife that's predicted for each survey based on the number of fish aged. Basically, what we see in both cases, the surveys say that alewife population or the alewife catch is dominated by age 2.
I can't search the web on Apple Watch.
That's embarrassing. There's a dominance of age 2 fish here. We also see a decent contribution of age 1 fish in blue, and this is one of the things that drives home the difference in these two surveys. You can see Chuck and Bo didn't catch any little alewife this year. They usually catch at least a few, sometimes way more than a few, but they just didn't catch them this year. So one of the things to keep in mind regarding this age composition is for the acoustic survey, the catch composition, the age composition of the catch has changed a lot since 2016. 2016, 5% of the catch was alewife that were age 2 or older. In 2017, it went up to about 70%, and in 2018, it's almost 50%. So we're dealing with an older population, and this is likely to have some influence on how many spawners we have. So I mentioned that last data point in the bottom troll survey time series, and this map is one that highlights that this right here is what caused the increase in alewife biomass density from the bottom troll survey. It was a very large catch compared to virtually everywhere else, I think, and it shows here. You can see in the acoustic survey that they were much more evenly distributed than in the bottom troll survey, a lot fewer zeros. That's pretty common, especially when you factor in that this is all alewife and we catch a lot of little fish that the bottom troll survey doesn't catch. The take home for me from the acoustic survey map is that the eastern half of the lake seems to have the highest alewife density. This is basically 15 years of my life. The plot shows the patterns in age 0 alewife density over the years in this time series, and you can see in some years they were really high. Here's 2005. We're going to start a new index. It's the proportion of the lake's area that's covered by symbols. That'll be our year class strength measure. And 2010, it's the same sort of thing, really big symbols, but a lot of years you see not much happening, not much happening, not much happening. And one thing that's pretty common after about 2011 or well, maybe 2013 is the north half of the lake isn't that productive from what I can see. So now we'll move on to rainbow smelt, and oddly enough, these two surveys seem to show more or less the same thing for rainbow smelt. Rainbow smelt remain much lower than they used to be 1980s, 1990s. Basically, acoustic surveys in the 1980s found the community was dominated by rainbow smelt. It's shifted now to one that's dominated by bloater or bloater and alewife, depending on which survey you want to talk about. So we have fairly low numbers for the bottom trawl survey, but these two surveys, as I said, are pretty consistent. It's not what I would expect. For larger rainbow smelt, the same thing. We can see they basically become super rare in these surveys, and a number of people have speculated on the cause for this. I'm not going to do it, but it's not just showing up here, it's showing up in commercial effort as well. So it's not an anomalous thing. To sort of drive home what we see with rainbow smelt, here's the same sort of map. And the acoustic survey is on the left, bottom trawls on the right. You can see that Jason Smith and Dale Hansen got to catch all the smelt in the acoustic survey, and most of them from the bottom trawl survey were over in Wisconsin. They're pretty rare. So moving to a native fish that has historically been pretty important and has historically supported some commercial fishing, see a lot of variability in the small bloater, really high levels in the 1990s from the, or 80s and 90s, the 80s for the bottom trawl survey, and from 2005 on, that they've been pretty different between the two surveys, with generally us getting or seeing more in the acoustic survey. The last data point here for the acoustic survey and the bottom trawl survey both is about the lowest they've been. So I'm not sure I understand that, but that's the way this data set works. This is the large bloater, and you can see this is probably our most reliable measure of these organisms because it's so long. They were hugely abundant in the 1980s with the peak in, I think, 1989. And since then, both surveys have said that they're relatively low. There is some evidence of an increase right here in the last few years that may have been the result of these large numbers of small bloater. And in the next year or so, we'll actually be able to say that because those fish are aged and will be in the database soon. This is a map showing the bloater. Basically, the acoustic survey, it was a set of estimates that showed they were patchy relative to other fish species, but they were more widely distributed in the acoustic survey than in the bottom trawl survey. So next, Cisco. Why am I going to talk about Cisco? Well, because they're an important native fish that a lot of people care about. There's fisheries for them in some locations, and all I'm going to say, really, is we caught in this acoustic survey 3 Cisco, and I decided to actually generate density estimates for the transects where those Cisco were caught. 2 were caught in Grand Traverse Bay, and 1 was caught south of the Upper Peninsula, sort of near Manistee. So at the lake scale, you can see, oh my gosh, they're really nowhere else but here. I decided to sort of zoom in, and you can see that even within these areas where they're located, they're really not very abundant. There's spots in those little localized areas where we didn't have any. So this does not rely upon trawl data to get you the estimate. It's strictly target strength. And one of the issues with catching 3 Cisco is it's hard to do a good job of estimating density. On top of that, if you go to Lake Superior and ask around the different agencies there, there's 4 different methods used to estimate density of Cisco right now. And nobody seems to be able to conclude which one is the best one. So, Lars, you have a job now. This is a plot showing the time series that I put together for these fish. And basically what it shows is Lake Huron, two pieces of Lake Huron where we consistently get Cisco in the work that Tim O'Brien does, and Lake Superior in 2011, and way down here is Lake Michigan. It's around 1.5 fish per hectare. So it still looks like they're very low abundance, and they're definitely very localized. Next, I'm going to talk about the benthic fish from the bottom trawl. Basically, I'm going to show you sculpin on the same plot here. The black is the deep water, and the blue is the slimy. And you can see the difference over time, and much more of the deep waters. And you can see also this very big decline until recently. There's been an increase over the past few years. Really not much pattern in these low numbers of the slimy sculpins. And then everybody's favorite, the brown goby. These estimates, they're kind of all over the place. I don't know that this is the best measure of their abundance, but it's the one we have. And suffice it to say that they're pretty abundant in some areas. A lot of variability associated with these estimates, so it's really tough to say that one year is any different from another. Having said that, 2018, there seems to be an increase. So next I'll talk about the survey comparison. It's pretty brief. It's basically one slide, as usual, and it's summarized by the common species that we see in both surveys with alewife, bloater, and rainbow smelt. And basically what we can see is that for alewife, the acoustic survey is telling us that there's about 10 times more biomass of alewife than the bottom trawl survey. We can see bloater, they're a lot more similar, and rainbow smelt, they're a lot more similar. So this has been something that's kind of grown in the past few years. That difference has grown in the past few years, and we're not sure we understand why. So, in conclusion, the relative abundance of fish in this most recent year of our work is low compared to the period prior to the 2000s, and is something that we see in numerous data sets. We see it in our surveys. We see it in predictions from the stock assessment model for alewife, which actually doesn't use these surveys for scaling. It uses a prediction of consumption for scaling. We've seen it in commercial fishing as well. So I think that's fairly safe to say still. The acoustic survey does show that there is an increasing trend, and the increase is happening in the last 3 years primarily with alewife, and their density is highest since 2004. There is definitely control on the alewife population's longevity. The population is dominated by age 1 and age 2 fish. However, those fish are bigger than they were last year, which indicates they're growing, and the biomass density went up, which indicates they're surviving as well. So very few fish in the large end of the range on either survey. There were a few in the 200 or so range caught in the bottom trawl survey, none in the acoustic survey. That change in size, which I think is driven by predation, ultimately impacts how many eggs are produced each year, because smaller fish produce fewer eggs, and they don't, we think, start spawning until their second year of life. Cisco, they're still pretty localized. They're still pretty rare compared to Lake Huron or Lake Superior. I don't think there's any doubt about that. We'd really like to find ways to do a better job of assessing these things, maybe putting more effort into the areas where they are showing up regularly. And that's something that I've been talking with at least 3 or 4 people in this room about for some time. So hopefully we'll do another more intensive survey in the summer this coming year. Alewife and bloater are relatively widely distributed, at least based on the acoustic survey. 11 of 15 years in this time series show pretty low age 0 alewife density in the north part of the lake. There's a more recent concentration of these things in the south end of the lake. The age 0 fish basically are telling us, I think, that the production is primarily in the south half of the lake. I think this is worth looking at and looking into further than we have already. And I think it's something that a number of people are interested in finding out the cause of, particularly whether or not some of the tribs in the southeastern portion of the lake are having influence here or not. Rainbow smelt distribution is limited. They're really, really uncommon. And I don't know if they're coming back or not. I think it's pretty safe to conclude that to really get a good picture of things, we need data from both of these surveys. I think they complement each other very well. I think that in spite of the fact that some estimates of shared species are quite different, they're still useful to have. I think the biomass estimates for rainbow and smelt being as similar as they are is quite surprising. And that's it.